I've been reading my next guest's work for quite a long time. I'm delighted to have him join us on the program, even though the subject matter is not entirely delightful. Just a personal note to show this program is called the 0 Hour, as you may know, because of the urgency of several crises we now face, paramount among them the crisis of climate change. Roy Scranton, among his books, is Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, Reflections on the End of a Civilization, as well as We're Doomed, Now What? Total Mobilization, World War II in American Literature. His latest, War Porn, his latest is I Heart Oklahoma, and Roy wrote a terrific op-ed recently in the New York Times that I really wanted to talk to him about. And the headline it was given, we don't always write our own headlines, we can talk about that, but climate change is not world war. So without any further ado, first of all, Roy Scranton, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me on, RJ.
Oh, absolutely. And thanks for writing this piece, by the way. I thought it was terrific. And rather than summarize your work, I'm going to do what a lot of writers hate, which is I'm going to ask you to summarize your work.
Sure. So this editorial specifically takes up the language that has been floating around for a few years now, used by climate change activists and people like Al Gore and Bill McKibben, that we need to mobilize on a World War II scale to address climate change, and it takes up that language, seriously considering what that would mean. I've been working on a book, you mentioned Total Mobilization. This is a book I've been working on for the last several years about World War II and American literature, and thinking about what World War II meant for American culture at the time. And we tend today to look back on that war through kind of rose-tinted glasses, through this series like Band of Brothers, and think of it as this period of heroic sacrifice. We tend to be pretty romantic about it, but it was actually really fraught, difficult, traumatic time for most Americans. And what it meant to mobilize the nation for war in the 40s wasn't it wasn't the way we often think it was. It was very divisive. It was built on racism, largely, against the Japanese. It was full of compromises, not just with, not just the real collusion with industry, right, to build the war and to change the war effort, but also political compromises, such as allowing Jim Crow legislation, Jim Crow laws to continue to obtain across America, particularly in the South, even as African Americans were being drafted into the military. And so it was a really complex, contentious, difficult period that we tend to look back on through the lens of victory and think, oh, it was all wonderful. There's a lot of things that get left out when people make this rhetorical move to say that, oh, climate change is like World War II. We need to mobilize like World War II. And I don't think that's it's good language to be using, and I don't think it's a helpful way to think about what kind of response is necessary to address global catastrophic climate change.
Yeah, and I thought one of the things that I found so provocative and helpful for me in my own thinking, reading your piece, first of all, I I was fascinated to realize in reading it that I had automatically embraced this rhetoric of the moral equivalent of World War II, or the total equivalent of World War II. And, I found it useful in certain ways because, for example, John Maynard Keynes in around 1940 wrote the book How to Pay for the War. So I knew that using a war metaphor would allow people to stop worrying so much about deficit spending and start worrying more about something of much more urgent and broader nature than something like that. So I found things kind of convenient about using the war metaphor, but I realized that in doing so, first of all, that I was unthinkingly, until I read your piece, reinforcing a militaristic way of looking at the world that is not helpful in a situation like this, and that I was overlooking another important point that you made, which I guess on some level had been niggling away at me, which was World War II had an easily identifiable and even demonizable at times enemy or pair of enemies in Japan and Germany. But as you say, if the real enemy is capitalism, at least capitalism as we understand it, then the war metaphor is not only not helpful, it's actually counterproductive. I think that was my takeaway from it. I don't know if you feel I'm getting that right or not.
Yeah, no, I think that's certainly one of the strong arguments against using the war metaphor. People will point fingers at, Coke or ExxonMobil. People rightly identify petroleum and fossil fuel industries as, deeply complicit, agents of global warming. And say that that's the enemy. That's the enemy there. But it's really it's not the same. Mm-hmm. It's because it's not just ExxonMobil that needs to be attacked, as it were, or confronted in terms of to deal with climate change. Right? It's the entire infrastructure, energy infrastructure of the modern societies that we live in, right? We couldn't just, we've already lost one Koch brother. You can't just kill the other one and that's going to solve climate change. That's not how it works.
Right.
We're really talking about, in order to address carbon emissions, you're really looking at a social and technological revolution from top to bottom, and there's not an enemy. There's not an enemy for that, and it's really. I don't think it's likely going to motivate. Part of the idea of mobilization is mobilizing voters, motivating voters and citizens to get behind a kind of mass movement. Then I don't think pointing the finger at oil companies or people who drive cars or people who fly in airplanes is necessarily gonna activate the same kind of motivating hatred that was pervasive in the United States, right? In the wake of the attack on Pearl Harbor and the Philippines.
There's so many dimensions to this. And again, we're talking with author Roy Scranton, author of Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, about his recent op-ed in the New York Times. It raises so many issues. I think about, I constantly go back to that issue of 100 companies that are creating supposedly 71% of carbon output. I think something needs to be done about them. But then I guess part of your point is, okay, we can do something about them, but without a major structural change in the way we consume energy, in the way we distribute energy, in the way we package things, a million different, the food we eat and so on, then other entities will spring up in their place until those things have changed. But you also, you mentioned hate as a motivator, as well as, the trauma of war. Clearly there was a huge, I mean, you've just been studying the literature of World War II, but just looking at the popular culture of World War II, the cartoons and the songs and so on, there's a huge element of race hatred in a lot of that literature. Does it have to be hate that motivates us to do something? I mean, I know this is a deeply philosophical question to be throwing at you, but is there another way to mobilize people for what needs to be done that doesn't involve hate, or do we need to hate something non-human and inanimate or conceptual? Do you see, how do you channel that?
Right. That's a good question. And I think it exposes another discrepancy or disjunct in the analogy between World War II, the false analogy between World War II and climate change, in that what mobilization meant in World War II was, of course, millions of people doing all kinds of things, from Rosie the Riveter to, shipyard workers in Oakland, to at the front lines, right? 16 million men who were drafted into the military, many thousands of which went overseas and risked their lives. Many, hundreds of thousands died, but the men who risked their lives and also were willing to kill Japanese and German soldiers in order to win the war, right? That's what the mobilization was all directed toward, which was acts of physical violence against these identified enemies in order to make them give up, in order to make them stop fighting. With climate change, right? That's not. We're not going to shoot climate change. So what would we be motivating? Like what's the idea that we're trying to motivate these people for? To march, to protest, to try to get laws passed. There's a disturbing vagueness, right, about when it comes to how this mobilization is exactly supposed to work, and so, all that hatred, in Popeye cartoons and Bugs Bunny cartoons and in magazines and newspapers. There's a famous picture in Time magazine of a young woman holding a Japanese skull that her husband had sent her, or that her boyfriend had sent her from the South Pacific. I believe Time magazine, or Life. I don't recall. Anyway, that kind of hatred may well be necessary to motivate an entire society to go risk to send men to go risk their lives and also to kill people in order to achieve a goal. The goal with climate change is not, as far as I can tell, to go blow up gas stations and kill oil company executives. If it were, then that same level of hatred might be necessary. But then the question, opens up. Well, then what would we be mobilizing people toward? And how do you motivate people to if not risk their lives, be willing to sacrifice their way of life? Right. Like, how do you do that? The analogy sort of falls apart, and this whole other question opens up, which is more a question of how do you motivate people to be willing to give up their way of life as they know it in order for an uncertain future, in order to be able to have an uncertain future, right? That's what we're asking. That's what needs to happen with climate change. It's a completely different framework.
So the logical next question, Roy Scranton, to me anyway, that comes out of that, besides, that is the question, right? But the logical one that comes out of that is, why doesn't the war metaphor get us there? And why doesn't it accomplish that? Besides the reasons you've listed, is there a way to transmute that? And my answer is probably not, for an underlying reason we haven't even discussed yet, which is it's any simple answer runs the risk of turning into a kind of placebo or emotional inoculation against the gravity of the situation. I think what I mean by that is, oh great, we got to fight a war like World War II. Fine, I get it, fine. Well, Johnny goes marching to war, we'll have posters. And then you feel like you've done something about it. Just as I feel sometimes there's a placebo effect to some of the well-intentioned recycling. Recycling is clearly a good idea, but it's minuscule compared to the scope of the problem we face. But people, well, I recycle. I took care of that whole environment thing. So I guess my biggest fear, and maybe the last thing I would ask you is, how do we protect ourselves, if you agree with my thesis, against these sort of inoculations and go about the task at least of crafting what the metaphor is we should be living by to address this challenge?
Well, what I've come to, and the sort of articulation that I've been working on in my own thought in the past 5-6 years that I've been writing about climate change is this idea of learning to die, and this idea of coming to accept that we've already failed, that regardless of whether we achieve a revolution in global energy systems or not, way of life, this way of life that we live in now, is over, and we need to accept that and come to terms with it in order to be able to begin to imagine any kind of new future. And this is the point that a lot of my critics take a superficial reading of what I'm saying. Learning to die, we failed. Oh, you're saying give up. You're saying that we can't do anything. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that is two things. One, that catastrophic global warming is at this point inevitable, right? Even if the next 10 years saw a massive global revolution in energy systems, right? There's so much carbon already in the atmosphere, right? And the oceans, that the planet's going to change into something else. That is a fact that we need to come to terms with. The other issue is this, that there's two paths forward for the civilization that we live in. One is collapse. Mm-hmm. The other is a complete transformation, total transformation of the infrastructure, the energy politics, everything, the way that we eat, the way that we get around, the way that we dress ourselves, the way that we communicate and organize our society, is a complete revolution, right? Off of fossil fuel capitalism into some new way of life. So either way, collapse or revolution, right? We're facing the end of life as we know it and the beginning of a whole new world. That's what I think we need to be thinking about and coming to terms with. That, for me, is begins to approach some kind of adequation, some kind of adequate metaphoric space to be able to really think about the predicament that we're in right now. It's bigger than war. It's bigger than a world war. It's bigger than anything that we've seen in human history. It's the question of whether or not human beings are going to be able to continue to live on this planet. So that,
so
that
Yeah,
might seem extreme. That for some people that's extreme or nihilistic or whatever. But I think the stakes, the issues are really that severe, and the stakes are really that high.
well, if you have another couple minutes, I'd like to explore that a little bit because I think there's a lot of truth to that. And, it's hard to follow a statement like that with, but on the upside, right? But on the upside,
Yeah.
we don't have to kill anybody to do that, right? Which is going back to your op-ed, we're not
Right.
being asked to mass murder the population of Dresden or Hiroshima as part of this. We're actually being asked to envision a way of life that minimizes the death and hundreds of millions of refugees and so on that appear to be the inevitable sequelae, I guess, of where we're going. And we need to envision a world where we A, mitigate harm, and B, we can view it as perhaps correctly as the dying of a civilization is certainly the dying of an empire and perhaps the civilization along with it, or we can view it if we choose to, and maybe I'm being Pollyanna-ish here, Roy Scranton, but perhaps we can view it as the moving into the next stage of what we need to do as a people. And yes, there will be, as a humanity, yes, there will be pain, yes, there will be sacrifice, but we can do it in a way that ensures that the world we build is as humane as possible, and that, in fact, may be our mission living in this moment in history. So I don't know, does any of that make sense to you?
Yeah. I think what you say is very, very hopeful, and I don't. I think the odds are that it's probably going to go the other way, but I do think what you're saying is possible, but only if we're willing to, only if we can figure out how to take that leap into a future which will be completely different than the world that we live in right now, right? Only once we're able to let go of the ways that life makes sense to us now, the ways that we live, maybe, and even our sense of what a good life is, only after we're able to take that, to let that go and take that leap, will we be able to begin to imagine what life in this new world will be.
So two thoughts from me, and then I'll let you conclude if you wish. But thought number one is the other day somebody tweeted a picture of a starship, Star Trek starship, and said, in the 23rd century, they'll name a starship after Greta Thunberg. And it may be, I liked it at the time, but it may be that a starship is an extension of our 20th century view of ourselves as ever advancing in the industrial technological space. And it may be that we need to accept that our future does not include starships. That's thought number one. And thought number two is maybe all the dystopic literature and popular culture we're seeing now, from The Walking Dead to, I'm sure we could both name dozens of things, but maybe that is all, in post-World War II, it was about the nuclear bomb, but maybe now the resurgence of that is an attempt to imagine that world, and so far we just can't imagine it positively. Those are my closing thoughts, but I don't know. What are yours?
Yeah, no, I think on the second point, you're right. We're, especially with a lot of the dystopian imaginaries that we've got now. I think if anything, they show the manifest failure of imagination to really take that leap. Which is interesting. We could talk about, but I want to come back to your first point. That's a funny thing, and I grew up watching Star Wars. In many ways, it's a very utopian sort of narrative. But the thing that I think often gets forgotten is what happened between Gene Roddenberry's 1960s and the 23rd century, right? There, and this is where Khan comes up, right? Like as in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, which is for me always the best Star Trek film. Who is Khan? Khan, it was a cryogenically frozen, basically kind of like a barbarian warlord from the period in Earth's history, right, between the 60s and between the 20th and the 23rd century, when civilization fell apart and there were nuclear wars and horrific fighting and a complete collapse, out of the ruins of which emerged a new civilization that became Starfleet, right? And so it's interesting for Khan to come back then in the original series and then in the film Star Trek II as this kind of return of the repressed, this remainder of Earth's violent history that often gets forgotten. If there is a starship in the 23rd century named Greta Thunberg, the USS Greta Thunberg, that would be great. But I think if that happens, there's going to be a similar period in between now and then that will be looked back on with horror and regret.
I think that's a great thought, and I'll just leave you with this. The movie Forbidden Planet, if you'll remember, Dr. Morbius, whatever his name was, built a wonderful future civilization, but the monster turned out to be his subconscious, his liminal, his limbic brain from our period too. So maybe that tells us who we should be mobilizing against, right? And unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there, but Roy Scranton, author of I Heart Oklahoma and Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, and this recent op-ed in the New York Times, which I encourage everyone to read, Climate Change is Not World War. Thanks for all this writing and thinking, and thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me, RJ.